We hope you all had fun virtually camping with us yesterday. Thank you for joining us again today for the second day of our 3-day third-party risk management bootcamp. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use. If you're not familiar with our webinars or did not join us yesterday, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide the widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of the widget. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can submit them through the Ask Question widget. We love getting questions and do capture all of them throughout the session, so we'll be answering some during the live webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer, we will address via email. In the Related Content widget, you will see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, a link to our resources library, which has hundreds of educational resources and links to several specific resources that we feel are helpful. You will notice underneath the slide area and next to the Related Content widget is a graphic showing the third-party risk management lifecycle. This will be helpful to reference throughout today's sessions to understand at what point these topics fit into the overall third-party risk management process. Today's live session is eligible for up to 2 CPE credits, 1 per hour. If you wish to receive these credits, please remember to answer all of the polling questions that will appear on your screen during each session's presentations. You will also be sent a follow-up survey link 24 hours after the bootcamp has concluded on Friday, September 22nd that will need to be completed in order to receive the CPE credit. We hope you found day 1 of the bootcamp valuable. We covered inherent risk versus residual vendor risk and the basics of what you need to know, as well as steps and strategies for vendor due diligence. Today, we're going to cover vendor contracts, mitigating supply chain risk with business continuity and third-party risk management, vendor data breaches and vendor stock reports, and complementary user entity controls. For the next hour, we will be joined by VinMinder's president, Kelly Vick, who will talk about critical vendors and fourth parties within vendor contracts. After Kelly's session, we will hear from VinMinder's Information Security Operations Director, Lisa May Hill, who will discuss supply chain risk mitigation with business continuity and third-party risk management. At 2 p.m. Eastern Time, Lisa May will be back to talk about vendor data breaches, as well as SOC reports and complementary user entity controls. This next session on vendor contracts is part of the tail end of the onboarding stage of the third-party risk management lifecycle in the contracting step. It is also part of the ongoing stage in the renewal step. With all that being said, I'd like to hand it over to Kelly. Kelly, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jessie. And we have so much to cover in today's boot camp, so we're going to jump right in and take a quick look at the 4 items on our agenda for this first session, and that is we're going to talk about the what, the why, and the who of vendor contract management. We're going to talk about your fourth-party vendors and some contract considerations, your critical vendors and contract considerations, and then we'll finally take a quick review of some exit strategies when it is time to leave that vendor. So this is a really good place to start, and that is to talk about what is contract management. Well, contract management is the oversight of your written agreements that you have in place with your third-party vendors and suppliers that provide you with products and services. Included in contract management is negotiating the terms of those contracts to make sure that all of the terms and the provisions and the controls that are important to you and hopefully that you discovered during the due diligence phase are actually addressed in the contract. It also includes a process for ensuring that that contract is reviewed and approved and executed properly. And that should be identified in your third-party risk management program where it spells out exactly what that contract management process should look like. Contract management also includes ensuring that all of your vendor contracts, all of your third-party contracts, despite the value of those contracts, are stored in a central repository with proper controls And I can tell you this one is very important and one that we see challenging quite often as we're working with customers and onboarding them onto our platform. Finding all of those contracts tends to be a challenge for many people. And lastly, contract management also includes the ongoing maintenance of that contract and that vendor relationship. So it's important that you review the contract terms over the life of the contract so that you are sure that there is adherence to the terms, you don't miss critical dates, you're managing performance of the vendor against expectations, etc. The takeaway here is that contract management is not a one and done process. On this slide, you will see a long list of major elements that should be included in all third-party vendor contracts. The recent interagency guidelines that was just published in June of this year outlines the specific requirements as it relates to the financial institution space. And this guidance would be beneficial for really any industry to review since the financial institution space is so heavily regulated. Each of these elements or provisions that's listed on this slide should be clearly outlined in your third-party vendor contract. And more importantly, you need to understand the impact any changes to these provisions or any missing provisions could have on your organization. It's also important to understand any other regulatory requirements that are specific to your organization and industry that needs to be addressed or outlined in your third-party contract. As I said, this is a long list, and for the sake of time, I can't cover them all, but you will have access to this presentation. As it relates to these provisions, the devil is truly in the details, and it's worth making sure that your contract team has the experience needed to manage contracts effectively. Now let's take a quick review of the contract structure. First, your organization really must be very diligent in drafting, negotiating, and executing any critical vendor contract. As I mentioned earlier, your contract language should include provisions that will reduce or mitigate any material risks that you actually hopefully uncovered during that due diligence phase, and that is specifically related to the business arrangement that you have with that third party. Your contract language should be clear and written or at a minimum reviewed by legal professionals who have the relevant domain expertise. And your contract should be structured in a format that is appropriate to the relationship that you have with that third party, and it could include other related agreements such as a statement of work, an order form, pricing tables, and any other exhibits that are material to the scope of the agreement. Those due diligence reviews that I've mentioned, by the way, 3 times now, should be completed in advance of executing that contract. And if you uncovered any issues that do require remediation, you should memorialize those in the contract. You might even go so far as including the dates of expected remediation and how that remediation evidence will be reviewed and approved. And execution of the contract before due diligence is complete can definitely create practical and maybe even legal issues. If issues do require remediation and they are discovered through due diligence, but the contract had already been signed, you may have lost some valuable legal leverage to require remediation. However, we all live in a world of you must do things when you need to do things. So there are times and reasons when you may sign a contract before you've actually done due diligence. In that case, you should include a contract clause addressing how any post-contract issues are to be remediated. As I mentioned just a few slides back, contract management is not a one-and-done step. The contracts require monitoring, just as the vendor does. So when you are performing those periodic vendor reviews, include a review of the contract. In that monitoring, you would want to consider if there were any contract changes that might be needed due to any regulatory reasons, possibly any changes in laws, especially with all the privacy law changes. Maybe there's other business reasons you might need to look at some contract changes. You would also want to review the vendor's performance against the SLAs, their KRIs, or KPIs, and identify any issues that are in immediate need of correction versus waiting to address them with a contract renewal. And critical vendor contracts really should be monitored for expiration dates as well, so that you are always prepared for that contract renewal or termination at least 120 days in advance. So stated twice now, those responsible for the vendor relationship should also be reviewing the contract as part of their ongoing review of the vendor. So having access to the contract is an essential part of successfully reviewing it on a regular basis. A best practice is to retain the contract along with the relevant vendor and vendor product profile data in an accessible system, preferably the same system, and preferably one where all third-party vendor data, contracts, and other relevant documents are kept centrally. Foreign courts and laws may differ substantially from U.S. courts and laws. So if you are working with a third-party vendor and that vendor is a foreign-based entity, then it is strongly advised that you seek expert legal advice in writing that contract. There are special considerations that need to be included in the contract, and this is one area where the appropriate legal advice is needed. And as we all know, there will be times when you want to do business with a third party, and that third party is just either refusing to participate in due diligence, or there's just some reason why you need to move forward with signing the contract before you can do that. And I mentioned this previously as well, but in those situations, you certainly need to ensure that you have some language in the contract that allows you to manage it very tightly should situations occur, should there be reasons that you are to exit the contract prior to termination. Just take whatever appropriate action and steps are necessary because of the risks that it puts you in having not done that prior due diligence. And as if the first list that I gave you several slides back was not long enough, here's an additional list of provisions you may want to consider adding, especially for your critical and high-risk vendors. And as I'm looking at this, I can already see a couple of overlaps. But again, I'm not going to read through these just for the sake of time, but when you do receive this presentation, you will have access to this information. The bottom line is writing a contract involves having legal expertise involved, having a strong contracting team to understand what these provisions mean, and having knowledge of these provisions to ensure that you include the right ones in each contract.
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. Please remember, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This first question is, do you currently perform due diligence or vetting on your third parties, vendors, or suppliers prior to signing a contract with them? Yes, no, with some but not all, or not sure? Kelly, we have a question here from the audience that we could answer. And this question is, when should you consider a contract renegotiation with a third party?
One time would certainly be if you are experiencing any type of performance issues with that third party. That would be a perfect time to suggest and ask for a renegotiation of the terms, and likely insert a service level agreement if you don't already have a service level agreement with that particular third party. Another time might be if you are, in a budget crunch and you are needing to reduce some costs. If the vendor wants to maintain your business, maybe there's some negotiating power that you might have to reduce your cost. Another time might be when there are changes in the regulatory or environment that requires you to renegotiate some of the terms in the contract, especially as it might relate to privacy and environmental requirements within your industry, things like that. So those are definitely a few ways and times when it may be a good time to renegotiate or attempt to renegotiate the contract.
Thanks everyone for answering that poll question. Here are those results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Before we move on, in the related content widget, you will find our benefits and best practices of midterm vendor contract reviews infographic available to view. Back to you, Kelly.
Okay, switching gears, let's talk about fourth-party vendors or subcontractors for a moment. Your relationship with a fourth-party vendor, also known as subcontractor, exists because you have a relationship with your third party with whom you have a contractual relationship. You don't, however, have a contractual relationship with that fourth party. It is important, even though you don't have a contractual relationship, for you to understand your third party's management practices of their own vendor so that you understand the risk associated with that fourth party. Before you determine the specific fourth party risk-related clauses to include in your contract with your third party, you do want to review your third party's risk management policies, procedures, and understand, again, the rigor and the effectiveness of their program. The good news is close to 75% of our survey respondents either perform or somewhat perform a review of their fourth party. So it is absolutely becoming a thing of what most organizations are doing, and is certainly a requirement with many regulations these days. Some things to consider when you are writing fourth-party requirements into your contract with your third party is, one, making sure that their standards, that they are managing their vendors to the same standards that you are managing them. So you want to make sure that their organization, that their third-party risk management program is including business continuity reviews, information security reviews, that they're compliant with all applicable laws, et cetera, et cetera. There's several of those critical items that you're going to review your third party on that you, again, want to require that they do the same thing with their third party. A few others to call out on this slide is a right to audit. If you're going to have a right to audit with your third party, you need to make sure that that is going to reach into your fourth party as well. Adverse events, you're going to expect that if there are adverse events with your third party, that you have some rights in the contract for notification, maybe termination, that needs to extend also into your fourth party. And that ongoing monitoring, again, you're going to require that of your third party, and you want them to require that of their fourth parties, and possibly even adding that you receive some of that same documentation as well. And a few final considerations to think about with your fourth parties is indemnification and insurance. Insurance is a pretty big one. So if you have some insurance requirements with your third party, and this is a critical and high-risk vendor, and you want to make sure those flow through to the fourth parties, that is something you need to ensure in your contract. Offshore activities, you may know where your third-party vendor is hosting their data, but what about the fourth-party vendors? And then another important one these days with all the privacy laws is destruction or return of confidential data. When you're requiring that of your third party, you need to ensure that that is reaching into any fourth parties that they may have as well. On this slide and the next, I provided some example language of some fourth-party contract clauses. So be sure to take a look at both of these pages when you receive the presentation. And again, just a few more examples of some contract clauses you may consider. And with that, I believe that brings us to the first poll question, so I will turn it over to you, Jessie.
Our second poll question of the day is, when you perform due diligence on your third parties, do you also perform some level of review or due diligence on your fourth parties? We review fourth parties only prior to signing the contract. We review fourth parties periodically based on risk. We review fourth parties at the same time as we review the third parties. We do not perform any review on fourth parties, or you're not sure. Kelly, I have another question here that we could go ahead and answer. And this question is, what responsibility does my company have when managing our fourth parties?
You certainly do have some responsibility. The challenge is you have no contractual relationship with the fourth parties because they are your fourth party through your third party. So contractually, you should obligate your third party to provide you the necessary information that you need to have oversight and ongoing monitoring of those fourth parties to what degree you feel is necessary with that particular fourth party. The regulatory environment, changes frequently, and at least as it relates to financial institutions, the new interagency guidelines certainly puts more responsibility around knowing and monitoring fourth parties than was there previously. So there is a requirement, and I would say a responsibility to some level to know those fourth parties, understand the risk those fourth parties are providing to you, and the best way to go about getting that information is through your contractual obligations with your third party.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. Before continuing, I would like to direct your attention to our vendor contract renewals checklist, and it is available for download in the related content widget. Contract renewal is a great opportunity to review your agreement and work with your vendor to renegotiate. And this handy checklist will help. Kelly, back to you.
Think for a moment about these questions. What would happen if your vendor simply couldn't continue to provide the service or the product to your organization? What would the impacts be? What would the impact to your customers be? This is where a third-party risk management team comes into play. It's their responsibility to make sure that every process deemed critical or high risk within the organization has more than one vendor that could foreseeably provide that product or service. It's also the third-party risk management team's responsibility to ensure that every critical or high-risk vendor is being monitored continuously to determine if and when that vendor may fail. Critical vendor failure is something you want to be able to predict at the earliest possible moment. This is called being prepared with an exit strategy. An exit strategy is important just because it keeps you prepared. You don't want to go into a relationship unprepared for what might happen when it ends. It provides you insurance against any messy, loose ends if you're not prepared for it to end. Unfortunately, though, exit strategies often slip through the cracks and are not put into place as they should. So this is certainly a good takeaway from this session. Here are 4 common exit strategies that you will want to talk through in advance. One is just to replace the vendor, called alternate. Another is to bring the activity in-house, called absorb. Third is to discontinue the activity or remove the dependency. And finally, a combination of the above 3 methods. So again, this is the things you're going to talk through as you are putting an exit strategy in place with each of your critical vendors. Here's 5 important steps that you should walk through to be prepared for these. One is to discuss that exit strategy as we just talked about. Bring all the right experts in to do that. Write out a detailed timeline of what would need to happen to minimize disruption to your business. Consider all of those alternatives that we talked about as far as the best way to unwind to replace this situation, to replace this vendor. Have it reviewed and maybe even test it if you can possibly do that, and then review that exit strategy periodically. Just like the contract, don't put it on the shelf and leave it. It needs to be reviewed periodically as well. And just a few things about testing the strategy. If it is practical to test the strategy, Make sure that you think through the appropriate time to test, who needs to be a part of it, and what are the objectives of that test, because obviously you're not going to absolutely end the relationship and start it back up again. It's going to be some kind of an objective other than making that full switch over, but thinking through the strategy and the testing of that strategy is a very important part in this process. Okay, I sped through a lot of that, but let me just cover these few key takeaways. One is that vendor contract management is the oversight of written agreements and something that goes along with your third-party vendors and suppliers. Contract language should contemplate the requirements that are necessary to reduce or mitigate the risks that you have with that particular business arrangement. Don't forget about those fourth parties when you are working with your third party and the contract language that you have in place with them, so that you can dive into the fourth parties with that contract language as much as you need to based on that relationship. And while it might be the last thing on your mind, an exit strategy is good insurance against a messy ending to a critical vendor relationship.
Great. Thanks so much, Kelly, for that informative session. Now I would like to introduce Lisa May Hill, who will discuss mitigating supply chain risk with business continuity and third-party risk management. This comes into play during onboarding for initial risk assessment and ongoing as part of your business continuity due diligence in the third-party risk management lifecycle. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you guys so much. Well, let's just jump right in. We're really going to talk about 4 primary topic areas. First, we're going to kind of touch on what supply chain management really is and how it fits into your third-party risk management. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the impacts of supply chain disruptions, like why is this important? And then supply chains and the risks that they present. And then, of course, we'll do some key takeaways. All right, let's jump in. Well, first, what we really want to talk about is, what is a supply chain disruption? Because I think a lot of times we make assumptions, we're not really sure, what the impact is, but before we can determine an impact, we really have to understand what it is that we're talking about. So a disruption can really be anything that negatively impacts the flow, creation, sale, distribution of a product. So there's some obvious examples of disruptions, things like disasters, earthquakes, tsunamis. The 2011 tsunami resulted in $210 billion in costs for Japan, and that affected supply chains across the globe. Shipping was impacted. Car manufacturing was impacted. Hurricane Sandy, when it hit New York in 2012, that really exposed the fragility of New York Harbor's fuel supply chain, things we never really thought about before. Pandemics. Of course, I don't think we even need to talk about COVID-19's impact. We're still kind of navigating that. But things such as severe financial fluctuations, dramatic changes to cost, disruptions in technologies. This can include things like changes and advancements such as AI, predictive technology, 3D printing, fog computing. Disruptive technology is really an advancement that changes the way businesses operate. So that can create a disruption in itself. And then you talk about things like cyber incidents and breaches, the impact that that kind of disruption has. Connectivity issues, things like brown and blackouts, the Texas power grid failure a couple of years ago, grand scale recalls. The healthcare business sees this obviously a lot. Things like we're still talking about the Tylenol recall of 1982, or from a technology perspective, the Samsung Galaxy in 2016. And then, of course, component shortages, the most recent automobile microchip shortages. These are all pieces of the supply chain and that broke down and caused a disruption that had a trickle-down effect. So when we talk about supply chain disruptions, we want to point out the industries that are really heavily impacted by supply chain. Manufacturing, they usually have a large number of third parties. That comes with a large amount of risk. Manufacturers are often directly impacted by supply chain disruptions, poor quality service, data breaches, so they really need to have recovery plans. They have to have robust due diligence processes, and they really need to manage their third-party relationships on an ongoing basis, and you need to see evidence of that. Retail industry, key issues remain with transportation of goods and labor. All U.S. importers and manufacturers have to comply with the UFLPA. So your organization needs to focus some additional effort on supply chain transparency to really determine exactly who your suppliers are, what they provide, and then understanding their suppliers, that whole fourth party piece. And then restaurants and food. We don't think of this as having an impact to us, but really restaurants and food impacts everybody. The rising cost of ingredients, labor, utilities, all because of supply chain disruptions, have really been putting pressure on companies in the restaurant industry. And you see a big trickle-down effect from that. And though, these are probably the three main industries that we see, any industry can be affected by supply chain disruption. So having an awareness of how those impacts touch different industries is important. So then we have to kind of ask ourselves, how does third-party risk management help address these supply chain risks? And it really matters because you're going to touch on supply chain risk in various different aspects of the life cycle of TPRM. So your initial risk assessment and due diligence of your vendors are going to help you identify any areas of concern within your supply chain. So when you perform a risk assessment and review due diligence, you're going to discover certain risks that need to be addressed. And these can include geopolitical risks that stem from a vendor that's affected by tariffs or modern slavery. These have been issues in the supply chain recently. It's also important to verify that your vendors have well-tested business continuity and disaster recovery plans in place. And this is really because you need to make sure that if something happens, that they have a plan to respond. These due diligence documents are going to provide evidence that your vendor can effectively respond to and recover from an incident. So making sure that those are up to date is paramount. Supply chain incidents aren't going to ever be preventable, but a business continuity and disaster recovery plan are going to help ensure that the impact to you and to them is minimal. And once you get past that initial vendor vetting, you want to look at ongoing monitoring of a vendor's risk and performance. This is going to help you stay aware of potential supply chain disruptions. Regular reviews and assessments of your highest risk vendors is part of a solid ongoing monitoring plan, and that's just going to include that supply chain. Third-party risk management is going to help you identify fourth or nth parties. These are your vendors' vendors. These are suppliers that don't have a contract directly with your organization, but they do work directly or even indirectly with your vendors. A critical fourth or nth party vendor can pose a risk to your organization, so it's going to be important to identify them when assessing your own vendors. This ensures that your vendors are properly managing their own vendor inventory. So you just want to be aware of your vendors' vendors and their supply chain. Where is everything coming from? So according to our annual State of Third-Party Risk Management 2023 white paper, almost 40% of survey respondents and or vendors said that they experienced an incident with some level of impact due to a supply chain disruption in 2022. And I think we're only going to see this number rise. So monitoring that supply chain is important. We're all feeling the strain of supply chain disruption, especially over the last year. High gas prices, long production times. We've had major storm events, more today than in previous years. There's really countless examples for us to continue to learn from. So understanding how your vendors plan to respond to business disrupting events and how they monitor their vendors is essential. So when assessing your third-party vendors, just ensure that they're disclosing to you any fourth or nth parties, your vendors' vendors, that they are considering critical, especially in providing products and services to you, or that could pose risks that could threaten your organization's operations. And that also includes regulatory compliance and reputational risk. So just making sure that you understand the path and the flow of all of the goods and services that you're getting from your vendors.
Our next poll question is, have you felt the impact of any of the recent technology supply chain disruptions, such as AI? Yes, no, or not sure? Lisa, we can go ahead and answer another question that is coming from the audience. And this question is, should you consider supply chain impact during your vendor due diligence process?
Thank you. That's a really great question. And the short, easy answer is yes. Ultimately, you want to understand the geographical touch points of your vendors to ensure that you can be proactive when issues occur. So you don't need to get fully absorbed into full supply chain management per se when you're doing your due diligence, but really having an understanding of that chain of goods and services, that flow of whatever it is you're using your vendor for and what they're getting from their vendors, that's really going to help you understand where you need to focus beyond just those direct third parties. So having that awareness of the supply chain can really be the difference between a proactive response that protects your reputation, your functionality, your customers, and a reactive response that's more about cleaning up a mess after something goes wrong. So that awareness is just really key to, part of that due diligence process as well as that business continuity and supply chain. They all go hand in hand.
Thanks so much, Lisa. We have just about 20 seconds left on this open poll question, so please do get those answers in quickly. If you have any issues submitting the poll, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. We'll be closing out in just about 5 seconds. Thank you. Here are those results. Thank you to everyone for answering this question. Before we continue with our discussion on supply chain, I'd quickly like to mention that our State of Third-Party Risk Management 2023 white paper is available for download in the related content widget. You may have an interest in this white paper if you would like to dive further into the topic, as it covers industry data around supply chain and third-party risk management starting on page 40. Back to you, Lisa.
So how exactly does supply chain tie into third-party risk management? Well, ultimately, understanding supply chain management and your vendor supply chain is only going to help you proactively understand the risks in your supply chain and what, if any, impact that could have on you and your organization. According to our annual State of Third-Party Risk Management 2023 white paper, 42% of respondents felt that third-party risk management really helped their organization avoid supply chain disruptions during 2022. And so what that really means is that the tie-in is that they balance off of each other. So things that supply chain management can help you with in third-party risk management are things like geopolitical risk, environmental, social, and governance, or ESG risk, issues like modern slavery, concerns around corruption and bribery risk, and of course the risk to your vendors' availability and business continuity. Those are all just pieces of the puzzle that kind of marrying that supply chain management and third-party risk management processes can help you with. So a lot of times these terms can all just feel like buzzwords, so I just want to talk about them briefly. Geopolitical supply chain risks are typically disruptive global political events that occur in areas impacting an organization's suppliers. So an example of geopolitical event is a country's conflict, such as the U.S. and China tariffs, or shifting trade relations, sovereign debt exposures, critical mineral competitions. Really understanding the geographic locations that are part of your supply chain can help you adequately plan for and react to geopolitical risks and incidents. So really understanding the geography of things is the first start in addressing the geopolitical risk. So as we all become more globally minded, it's really the responsibility of businesses to detect and mitigate environmental, social, and governance practices within their supply chains. ESG risk is really prevalent in a worldwide supply chain. Things that include things like raw materials, manufacturing, construction, but it's often obscured by the complexity within supply chains, things like multiple subcontracting relationships, corrupt third parties. So really understanding what fourth-party vendors are critical to your vendors and where they are located and what piece of the supply chain puzzle that they hold is going to be important to managing ESG risk. So modern slavery and human trafficking has really been something that businesses have been trying to address more proactively in the best way. So supply chain awareness is going to help with visibility into modern slavery and human trafficking. You want to ask questions about these things right in your vendor risk assessment questionnaires. Some examples are, is the vendor compliant with regulations and restricting modern slavery? For example, the Modern Slavery Act of 2015 in the UK, or the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Prevention Act in the US. Asking those specific questions gives you immediate insight. You want to know, do they have a modern slavery human trafficking statement? Is that part of their code? And what is the vendor's process for identifying, assessing, and addressing unethical practices that include the modern slavery and human trafficking? Do they have these things written into their policies and procedures? So next is corruption and bribery. Two common forms of corruption are bribery and fraud. Collusion can include bribes to ensure a supplier is awarded a contract or misrepresentation of goods and services. Corruption in the supply chain can lead to environmental issues, while aspects like human rights and worker safety also have to be considered. Reputational risk makes it challenging to avoid if corruption in the supply chain is made public. And this could lead to issues with your customers and suppliers in the future. So knowing how your vendors protect themselves against these risks is going to allow you a level of confidence and assurance. So a lot of times supply chain management and business continuity management go hand in hand. The ideas behind them, there's a lot of parallels. I like to use the ICE acronym to think of 3 points that you really want to use to help you determine how to minimize the risks to availability and business continuity, as well as supply chain. And that is I for identify. The first step in any facet of third-party risk management is going to be identifying and understanding your vendors and what they supply to you. You want to understand and identify that supply chain so that you can then look and see who are the fourth parties in it, who are the touch points along the path of getting that good and service to you. And then characterize. Identifying critical vendors allows you to focus your supply chain assessments where it matters most. Just like straightforward third-party risk management, you want to make sure that you're understanding criticality and weighting your effort on those that have the most value, are the most critical, and have the most impact to your availability. You're going to need to engage your critical vendors to understand if they source any critical components, materials, or services. And that's going to be your first link in the supply chain. And then evaluate. When evaluating your vendors, you're ultimately trying to determine how resilient they are to disruption and changing situations. It's also extremely important to understand how mature their response and recovery strategies are. So understanding your vendors' response and recovery strategies, and do those include bringing in their fourth parties and impacts from their fourth parties. I'm sorry, your fourth parties. But once critical vendors are determined, you should be validating that they have strong business continuity plans and practices. And you want to do this by reviewing and assessing their business continuity plans and testing regularly. Your vendor should be able to demonstrate strong preparedness across their supply chain and at least availability. But beyond that, things like crisis management, IT disaster recovery, and business unit continuity. You want to make sure that you're addressing it with your vendors and they're addressing it with theirs, and that both of those relationships meet your expectations. Okay, so now to get our hands dirty, we're going to talk about 5 tips for monitoring your supply chain. First, perform your due diligence. For individual vendors, for example, request copies of vendor code of conduct, third-party risk management policies and practices. Require proof of risk assessments and monitoring, as well as copies of their modern slavery statements and policies. You should also conduct audits of supply chain operations to find out how labor and material is sourced and the prices that are paid to suppliers further down the supply chain. You want to create your own supplier code of conduct. Implement written policies for suppliers that clearly outline standards and expectations for ethical behavior regarding labor, health, safety, and the environment. Along with a written code of conduct, suppliers can benefit from training that explains their contractual obligations to comply with ethical business standards and practices. Number 3 is monitor your vendors. Set up news alerts for your vendors and their industry. Set up ESG news alerts for your vendor and their industry as well. Use subscription-based risk monitoring and alert services to provide vendor risk intelligence. Include supply chain discovery in all of your regular ongoing monitoring. 4, know your technology. Understanding the technology used in your supply chain is going to help you mitigate risks that rise from technology disruptions. You have to understand what people are using to give you the goods and services that you're getting from them. Understanding new technology and advancements in the current tech is going to help you determine if and when changes may be needed to what you're doing. And then evaluate availability and resiliency. You need to ensure that you're assessing your vendor's ability to respond to supply chain risks. Do they have a plan if their critical third parties fail? You want to make sure that they don't only have a plan for themselves if they fail, but they also have something in place for if someone within their supply chain, in their vendor management, has a failure, and what the impact to you is. So for our last slide, we're just going to talk about a couple of quick key takeaways. Supply chain is more than what we often think of, especially as technology advances. It's obviously fits very well into third-party risk management, and it's really about having a proactive awareness of the geography of the services and products that you're getting. Know your supply chain. So understanding what's in your supply chain and where it flows through is paramount in being able to manage it. And TPRM can help you gain visibility into that and evaluate various supply chain risks as you do other risks within third-party risk management. But specifically, things like geopolitical risk, environmental, social, and governance, or ESG risk, things like modern slavery and corruption and bribery, and of course the risks presented to your availability and business continuity and the availability and business continuity of your vendors, which is why it's so important to assess your vendors' business continuity and resiliency plans and really understand if they have a plan to assess their vendors and those within their supply chain. And of course, understanding their response to supply chain risks and its impact to you. So making sure that your expectations are clear and that the things that they have in place will meet those expectations. And really, supply chain management from a third-party risk management perspective is that they go hand in hand. It's a piece of the puzzle. It's just part of the process. And the most important piece is being proactive and having an awareness so that you can address things and put plans in place to prevent as much of the risk as you can.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Before we move on to our next session, where Lisa will discuss vendor data breaches, we're going to take a quick 10-minute break. Please meet us back right here in 10 minutes. You do not need to close out and log back in. Just simply leave everything as is. Welcome back, everyone. We are now going to move into our next session, which is an understanding of vendor data breaches. Assessing cybersecurity to protect against data breaches occurs in both the onboarding and ongoing stages of the third-party risk management lifecycle. Again, you can reference the full lifecycle below the slides area on your screen. We are joined again by VinMinder's Lisa Mayhill, Information Security Operation Director. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Okay, welcome back. Today, in this session, we are going to talk about kind of an understanding of vendor data breaches. So from a vendor perspective, we're going to touch base on some notable data breaches, vendor cybersecurity posture and its impact, and what to do if your vendor suffers a breach, and then best practices when handling data breaches. All right, let's get started. Okay, so according to our annual State of Third-Party Risk Management 2023 white paper, 70% of respondents rated cybersecurity as a top concern. And this is because data breaches continue to increase and hackers are getting more creative. It's just a bigger issue today than it was yesterday, and it will be a bigger issue tomorrow than it is today. If the data breaches reported in the last few years are anything to go by, then any organization servicing consumer data should be striving towards very stringent information security and physical security controls. Hackers don't discriminate when they're looking for an asset to attack, and the common theme is not so much if that someone's going to be attacked or if an organization will be hacked, but when it will be hacked. So failed cyber attacks are noted on a daily basis, if not an hourly basis, according to a lot of industry contacts. And what that means is we're catching a lot, right? The people are putting things in place that are catching cyber attacks before they happen, but the number that still get through is huge and has a huge impact on all of us. Here are just some quick statistics as of July of this year. July saw 87 major data breaches alone. There have been several breaches just this summer, including places like the Marriott Shields Healthcare Group, Cash App. There are a million examples out there. If you're paying attention to the news or you have news alerts, you would have seen some of the big breaches that have been making the headlines. We talk about them in all of our webinars. You can see from these stats that the most breached sectors are healthcare, education, and the public. But that's ever evolving. The bottom line is, for me, what these statistics show is that the numbers just continue to grow, and the number of breached records is what is the most alarming statistic to me. This is individual records, so pieces of private information. So some notable vendor data breaches. Of course, we've all heard about MoveIt. MoveIt is software designed to move sensitive files securely, and it's a very popular application around the world. There are likely to have been hundreds of organizations affected worldwide. It's really telling how widespread this particular breach was. It really enabled hackers to access their server database. And it impacted, the trickle-down effect was huge. So Teachers Insurance and Annuity Association of America, we saw them become the latest in a long line of organizations to confirm that it had been affected by the MoveIt vulnerability. The Oregon and Louisiana Department of Motor Vehicles, they said that their department had compromised as part of the MoveIt software vulnerability. And then Genworth Financial, there was another organization caught up in the MoveIt breach. They had at least 2.5 million records exposed in that attack. So MoveIt alone was one breach that impacted multiple sectors and hundreds of businesses. And like I said, the trickle-down effect was just huge with that one single breach. Okay, so we have included this slide on the boot camps for as long as I've been doing them. The first time that I talked about privacy laws in a boot camp, I believe there were 4 states listed on this slide. Next time we do a boot camp, we're probably going to need 2 slides to talk about these privacy laws. 11 states now, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Indiana, Iowa, Montana, Oregon, Utah, and Virginia have enacted comprehensive consumer data privacy laws. They all have several things in common, things like the right to access and delete personal information, opt out of the sale of personal information. They have slight differences, but more states are following suit, with some still holding out in the hopes that a federal law will keep things more cohesive and clear across the board. Right now, 19 other states have active bills on the floor, with several looking to be passed relatively soon. So it's just more to know and more to understand. We hope that they continue to have commonality to keep it as simple as possible for those of us trying to follow them. But one of the great resources that I have found is to use the IAPP.org privacy legislation tracker. That's where this data comes from. There's a link on this slide. It's an excellent website, and it's a really good place to kind of keep up to date on the most current privacy laws. So what's your vendor's cybersecurity posture, and why does that matter when we're talking about data breaches? And really, understanding your vendor's cybersecurity posture is part of that, because you need to know if your vendor is prepared to prevent, detect, and respond to a cybersecurity issue or a breach or an incident. Many organizations invest really heavily in their own programs, but they don't invest as heavily in ensuring that their vendors are doing the same through their third-party risk management. So to help you identify whether your vendor's posture is appropriate, you really need to first identify the cyber threats that your vendor could present and take proactive steps to mitigate those potential areas of weakness. To do this, I always suggest to start with a risk assessment. This helps you determine the threats and vulnerabilities that your organization faces by using each vendor. And then you want to take the appropriate steps to determine whether your vendor is going to be secure and keep your customers' data secure as well, if they have access to that. And prior to signing a contract, proper due diligence should be performed. And ongoing monitoring should then be done year over year. And finally, you want to review if and how your vendor is preparing to prevent, detect, and respond to a cybersecurity issue or event. So what are they doing? What do they have in place to make sure that their response time meets your expectations and aligns with what you would want to see? So why is that cybersecurity posture important? Well, there's increased risk, especially from the shift to work from home environment. So monitoring your vendor's cybersecurity posture is going to be important because it enables you to mitigate risk by allowing you to influence the vendor to strengthen their controls or supplement their controls with your controls. And it also helps you make decisions on whether you should be using that particular vendor. So a vendor breach can have a big impact on you as well as your brand. We call that reputational risk, and it's obviously a big deal. And cybersecurity is also a hot button for regulators, so they're watching you as well. So staying on top of the cybersecurity risks of your vendors and understanding their posture is just a big part of protecting yourself proactively. Ultimately, you are expected to cover the CIA information security triad, which is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And so understanding how your vendors are doing that is going to be really important. It's required that you demonstrate that you're taking proactive steps to identify and mitigate potential areas of weaknesses with your vendors. And the best way to do that is to make sure that they have the proper policies and procedures in place. I know we say this a lot, but the domino effect is real, and a chain is truly only as strong as its weakest link. And industry best practice and regulatory guidance really wants you to consider all the potential ramifications posed by a third party, whether it's in the form of a full-on data breach or a business disruption. And from a planning standpoint, you need to consider all the possible problems that could occur, what steps you need to be prepared to take, and how long until normal operations can resume in order to minimize the impact to your organization and your customers if something were to happen. And that's why cybersecurity and understanding your vendor's cybersecurity posture is really important when we're talking about data breaches.
This brings us to the first poll after our break. And this poll question is, has your state adopted a privacy law yet? Yes, no, somewhat, or you are not sure? Lisa, while we wait for these results to tabulate, we can answer another question from the audience. And this question is, should we include breach notification requirements in our contract language with vendors?
This is another great question, and it's one that comes up a lot. I strongly suggest including breach notification requirements in contract language. The bottom line is that breaches are way more common than any of us really want to admit, especially our vendors. And having a proactive approach to notification is always going to be better. Your vendors may already have breach notification policies in place. Most of them probably do. But you want to know if those align with your expectations. And the only way to make sure that that happens is to talk about it during that contract phase. What you don't want to do is assume that what they're doing aligns with what you'd like to see, because ultimately their breach notification language in their policies and procedures is going to be designed to protect them. And you need language that's going to also protect you. And that's where that contract comes in. So the absolute best case is to come to an agreement with the vendor on what you would expect them to do and what they plan to do in the beginning phases of your due diligence. This really should include things like setting timelines, communication methods, and even what are the repercussions for failure to abide. So if they don't do what they say they're going to do, what's your plan? And you want to make sure that you're speaking the right language. So if you're unsure what your expectations should be and what all that technical language means within their policies, pulling in a SME is really going to help you because you also want to make sure that when you're putting technical expectations into those contracts that you're having the right people give you that information.
Okay, everyone, here are those results. Thank you for submitting your responses. Before we move on, as a reminder, in the related content widget, you will find our Setting Breach Notification and Cyber Right to Audit Expectations in a Vendor Contract infographic. Serious problems arise from third-party data breaches, so you must take steps to protect your organization. This infographic explains how. Lisa, back to you.
So I mentioned the CIA Information Security Triad. So what is that? Basically, it's the foundation for cybersecurity. And it includes confidentiality, which is the prevention of the unauthorized disclosure of information. To guarantee confidentiality under the CIA Triad, vendor communication channels and media have to be properly monitored and controlled to prevent unauthorized access. Confidentiality is huge when we're talking about breaches. There are a few key concepts such as principle of least privilege, separation of duties. These can start you down that right path towards ensuring confidentiality. The I stands for integrity, and what this means is ensuring that data is not modified by unauthorized means. To guarantee integrity under this model, vendors should be able to demonstrate that they have controls in place to protect information from unauthorized modification. One way to do this is by ensuring proper input, processing, and output controls are in place. And then finally, the A stands for availability. And this is ensuring that information is available when needed and only to those authorized to have it, and that's crucial. Vendors should be able to validate how they prevent and handle downtime and interruptions. So when we're dealing with cybersecurity risk, it can get overwhelming fast because a lot of people have a lot of vendors. And so we need to understand what type of vendors should be reviewed. At a minimum, you should be reviewing your high and critical risk vendors. And determining which vendors are higher critical risk, well, the simplest way to do that is to ask yourself just a few questions about each vendor. First, does the vendor process, store, or transmit non-public customer data, such as PII, personally identifiable information? Second, does the vendor provide a part of your service that would degrade your service's value if it was unavailable? If you answered yes to those questions, then those vendors fall into the bucket of who you should do first. Once you determine which vendors you'll review, you want to understand who's going to perform those reviews. On the cybersecurity side of due diligence, you really want to make sure that it's someone with a demonstrable knowledge across information security is performing those reviews. So you want someone with experience so that the review doesn't just become like a checkbox activity. This is not likely going to be your third-party risk manager directly, but rather a supporting resource from your internal InfoSec team. And if these resources aren't available within your organization, you should consider looking for a third-party risk management service provider for assistance. Okay, so what if you do all of the things and you still end up in the middle of a data breach or your vendor has a major data breach? Well, there are a handful of best practices. The first is be transparent. You want to be able to acknowledge a breach. It's painful. It is not the best place to be. But the mistrust and reputational damage caused by sitting on the news is going to far outweigh putting off the inevitable. Making sure that your consumers are hearing from you and not the news is going to be your best first step. You want to make sure that data breach notification requirements are documented in your contract language. The only way for you to get out ahead of something is to also be out ahead of something. So if you don't hear about your vendor's data breach until it goes on the news, you will not be able to notify your customers directly. And you want to make sure you tell the appropriate people. When required, you're going to need to notify the state AG, law enforcement, regulators. You want to make sure that you can notify consumers in the right time frame. Number 4, you want to define the impact of the breach. You need to understand what you're dealing with. Was the breach isolated to one individual, or did it impact many customers? You want to make sure you have a solid customer notification process in place. Like we said in number 1, it's really best to notify the impacted customers directly. So the more time you have on your hands, the easier that will be. And we always suggest to offer credit monitoring services. Ultimately, a data breach which contains non-public personal information of your consumers is going to increase that individual's risk of identity theft. So it's important to consider timelines as well, since once the data is out on the dark web, items such as social security number is unlikely to change. So giving them an opportunity to protect themselves is going to be very helpful. And then you want to implement more robust user authentication procedures. This should be done if customers have access to online tools. So a overarching password reset requirement is going to be something to consider. And then continuing on, you really want to be able to perform a root cause analysis and enhance security controls. Lightning does often strike twice, so you want to be able to learn from the breach and build a stronger information security system. And then you want to set expectations with your vendors. If the breach originated from the vendor and not your internal organization, then you need to perform deep audit testing. And if the vendor is unwilling to cooperate, then you have larger issues and maybe need to reconsider that partnership. Breaches happen, and if it happens at your vendor, they should be wanting to work with you to fix it and prevent it moving forward. And really, you should perform an assessment on your overall information security processes, including those that impact third-party risk management. Document all your updates and implement refresher training for all your employees. Make sure that this stuff is covered in your TPRM program as well. What's good for you should also be good for your vendors. And you want to make sure you bridge that gap.
Great. Thanks so much, Lisa, for that informative session. Now Lisa is going to continue the conversation with a discussion on vendor SOC reports. Lisa, back to you.
Okay, well, hopefully you guys are not sick of the sound of my voice yet, because we are moving on from data breaches to talk about SOC reports and complementary user entity controls. For our agenda, we're going to spend a little bit of time doing an overview of SOC report types and what makes up a SOC report, just because it's important to make sure that we have that baseline knowledge. And then we're going to talk about complementary user entity controls within the SOC report, common examples, how to review them, and then tips for mapping. So let's get started. Okay, so before we dive into this, I just wanted to have this a quick slide, and this just really summarizes the various SOC types that you're going to most commonly see. So you'll have your SOC 1, your SOC 2, your SOC 2 Plus, your SOC 3, and your SOC for cybersecurity. When we talk about SOCs, we are most commonly talking about SOC 1s and SOC 2s. SOC 1 reports are intended to be used to validate and verify that internal controls over financial reporting are sufficiently in place at your vendor for your contracted use of them. You want to review this SOC when you are primarily concerned about the impact of financial reporting. And these SOCs are generally meant for auditor use and compliance purposes. They should still be covering technology controls. I feel like I want to say that because a lot of times people assume that a SOC 1 won't have anything technology-based in it, and that's just not the case. SOC 2 reports are going to help you measure how the vendor provides their product or service under the umbrella of specific trust service criteria. This trust service criteria includes security, availability, confidentiality, privacy, and processing integrity. A SOC 2 is not necessarily going to cover all the trust service criteria, as vendors can choose which ones to be audited on. And the audience for a SOC 2 is going to be a bit wider than a SOC 1. And frankly, most of the time the SOC 2 is probably the report that you want if you have a choice. It's most definitely the report that you want from an IT vendor. A SOC 2 is really the only report that defines a consistent set of criteria specifically around products and services that a company provides to you. If you want a measure of how your vendor provides a secure, available, and confidential or private solution, then the SOC 2 is going to be the way to go. But again, if a vendor has both a SOC 1 and a SOC 2 and you have to pick one, I will always encourage you to take the SOC 2. Okay, so when we talk about SOC 1s and SOC 2s, we also need to talk about the different types that they can come in. Each SOC can be done as a type 1, which covers a point in time, or a type 2, which is performed over a period of time, typically 6 to 12 months. As type 1s are only a point in time, generally you're not able to determine the actual operating effectiveness of controls, only the design and implementation of them, whereas a SOC 2 is going to give you both. And the examples shown here, this is just the first paragraph of an auditor's report, and this is templated language found within the SOC report that demonstrates the as-of date for a type 1 and a date range for a type 2. Another option that you may see with a SOC 2 is it being combined with other control frameworks, such as the Cloud Security Alliance's Cloud Controls Matrix or the High Trust Common Security Controls. These are called SOC 2 Pluses. And SOC 2 Pluses have actually been around for a while, I believe since 2014, and are now becoming more and more common. We're seeing them relatively frequently. The topic of SOC 2s has come up more in the last couple of years as we're seeing a lot of large-scale vendors that cross industries really take advantage of them. And what they are is it's just a way to combine the trust service criteria with another audit framework, and it just creates a more valuable report, and it gains auditing efficiencies with testing like mapped controls across those frameworks. We get asked a lot about SOC 3s. SOC 3s are good for early vetting during that vendor selection process, but it's essentially a summary of a SOC 2 that comes with a seal of approval. So one advantage to them is that vendors can publicly share the report. They're easy to get. SOC 3s, however, do not include any actual control activities or testing performed. So what you're getting just isn't comprehensive. It's designed to be made available publicly without the requirement of an NDA. Therefore, it's going to be less technical, fewer details. You're not going to see anything really beyond the narrative section of a SOC. You're going to want to request a vendor's SOC 1 or 2 as part of doing your full due diligence. And I can't say this enough, but a SOC 3 should never, ever be used as the only report of control evidence that you review. Okay, so over these next couple of slides, we're just going to take a quick look at the anatomy of a SOC report and some of its key components. Every SOC report has basically the same layout. Section 1 is going to be the auditor's report. Here you're going to find key information such as who the audit firm is, whether it's a carve-out or inclusive report, the scope, and of course the auditor's opinion. We'll cover some more of these a little bit down the line. Section 2 is going to be the organization's management's assertion. And this section really essentially says that the organization will work with the auditors in good faith. And then Section 3 is the description of the system. This is the narrative of the report. Here you'll find the organization's representation of the in-scope system in a very narrative format. It will address topics like risk management activities, an overview of the organization's operations, and information about each control objective. And then sometimes audit forms will even put the complementary user entity controls here as well. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later too. Section 4 of a SOC report is going to be the actual layout of the control objectives and activities along with the testing and results of testing. Section 5 is an optional section, and this is a section that an organization can provide unaudited information that may assist in the understanding of the control environment. A lot of times in this section, you'll see business continuity and disaster recovery information. You'll see management's response to exceptions, that kind of info. Okay, let's look at some key components of the SOC reports that you should review. But first, it looks like we're going to have our first polling question of the hour.
The next poll question is, what is most valuable to you in a SOC report when performing due diligence? The auditor's opinion, exceptions and validating the controls, cukes, a combination, or you are not sure? Lisa, here's another question from the audience. Should SOC report reviews be a part of our normal due diligence of vendors?
Thanks, Jessie. Yes, I mean, SOC reports are always going to be a great place to start. And I think we always say kind of that rule of thumb is if your vendor has a SOC, then review the SOC, right? If they've invested in having a SOC perform or a SOC assessment performed on them, then the best thing to do is to take that opportunity to review those reports. The SOC report's really there for a reason. The bigger question is really when to go beyond the SOC report. And this question has so many variables. So you really need to understand the types of vendor that they are, what's their criticality, what's the risk they present to you, what's your dependency on them. These types of factors are going to be what help you determine when and really how far beyond a SOC to go. But as a general rule of thumb, simple answer, I always recommend reviewing the SOC report if they have one. The SOC is always going to be an extremely valuable, even just as a window into how the vendor operates. I will also say, though, that you do need to be careful about using the SOC as your only piece of due diligence. That's not generally best practice anymore, just because there's so much more to the due diligence process than just that SOC review, especially if they're a technology vendor, if they're a high-risk vendor, or a critical vendor.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer. Before continuing, I would like to direct your attention to our What to Do if your vendor has a negative SOC report infographic in the related content widget. This helpful resource provides 4 next steps to take after you receive an unfavorable SOC report. I'll hand it back to you, Lisa.
Okay, so getting into content and what to review in the SOC reports, really the first key component to mention is the system description and the scope of the report. You're really going to want to pay attention to a few things here, such as determining whether the vendor has provided the correct report. To do this, you want to check the scope of the report, verify it covers the services that you're contracted for, and the locations that they're supported out of. This just becomes important because multiple vendors' services can have separate reports, especially with those larger vendors. The next component to take a look at is going to be the subservice organizations. These are going to be any service providers used by your vendor, so basically your fourth parties. The report really should clarify exactly how these vendors and subservice organizations are used and whether they use the inclusive or carve-out method for the report itself. The majority of reports that we see, subservice organizations are carved out, meaning that their controls are not included. And really, we could talk about subservice organizations, and it's been a webinar by itself. But really, the biggest thing is understanding who they are and how they're used and how they're represented in the report. Another key component that you'll want to understand in your vendor SOC report is the auditor's opinion. This is always found in section 1, that auditor's assertion. There are 4 types of opinions generally: unqualified, qualified, disclaimer, and adverse. An unqualified opinion, often people think is bad. It's really the best news you can hear when you're discussing SOC report. And this should be the standard expectation. You actually won't even necessarily see the words unqualified opinion within the report anywhere. When the auditor feels that the vendor's description fairly represents the system and that the controls were suitably designed, and in the case of a Type 2 report, that the controls operated effectively, the report is considered unqualified. It means everything is as it should be. Just keep in mind that there can still be a number of exceptions or findings within an unqualified report. A qualified opinion is where the vendor had at least one control objective that was not implemented or operating effectively. In other words, a qualified report indicates that issues identified in the report were significant enough to deem one or more controls completely ineffective. You would want to make a special note of a qualified opinion. A disclaimer is used when there isn't any evidence to prove or disprove that a control wasn't being performed or was in place. And this can happen with controls that surround very rare occurrences. And then an adverse opinion is just bad. This means that the vendor held back or modified information and needed to verify controls were either in place or operating effectively. It's definitely a red flag and requires follow-up. So when we talk about the testing of controls and evaluating results, we really want to talk about that SOCs are built around a vendor's control objectives. And these are overall goals for a function. Control activities support those objectives, and auditors create tests for those activities where they may review, observe, interview, or all to determine whether the control is in place, and for Type 2s, whether they're operating effectively. If the testing doesn't go well, or if there's nothing to test, then exceptions or, in severe cases, deficiencies and material weaknesses will come into play. Though you don't want to see any of these, it is very common to have exceptions. And exceptions occur when not every sample tested passed. So you want to look at those and risk rate them. Review management's response. If one wasn't given, ask the vendor for one. Look for mitigations in place or that the vendor has since corrected the exception. A significant deficiency is when a control or a combination of controls are shown to not be working as designed, or if the control is being performed by someone who's unqualified to do so. Material weaknesses come from testing, showing that controls are not functioning. This results in clients not being able to rely on that function of the vendor. And though less common, significant deficiencies and material weaknesses are important to notate when found. Okay, so to quickly summarize the opinion component and exceptions, you want to look at the opinion to determine whether the report is a clean report with an unqualified opinion. And if not, what qualified the report? What was not operating effectively? And then you want to look for exceptions and notate that the unqualified report can still have exceptions. So you can't just rely on that opinion. You'll want to determine the impact to your organization from those exceptions, and then management's response if it was given, and whether there were any mitigating or compensating controls in place that will lessen the impact of the exception. Understanding that impact of the opinion and any exceptions to your organization is key when reviewing that SOC report. One quick note about control design. One aspect that many users of SOC reports don't know is that the organization being reviewed, or your vendor, is the one that writes and designs these controls, not the CPA firm performing the review. The control wording is included within the report, so are the tests that the reviewer performs. So in reviewing the report in detail, you can better determine the value of the report to you. A SOC is still better as a tool than trying to review a vendor's policies and program documentation as a whole, because at the very least, SOC report controls are transparently reviewed by a third party. Okay, so now let's jump into complementary user entity controls. A lot of those previous slides were probably review for most of you, and this is really, we're going to kind of get into the meat of complementary user entity controls now. I first want to say that complementary user entity controls are also known by their acronym, which is CUEC. Many people call those CUECs. Many people call them QEs. Some people call them CUECs. I have generally referred to them as QEs. So throughout the majority of the rest of this webinar, I will be using QEs to represent complementary user entity controls. They're also sometimes referenced as user control considerations, or UCCs, but more popularly used as CUEC. These are controls that the vendor has included within its system in which the user entity, which is you, must implement to ensure the vendor's control objectives are accomplished. In most cases, the control objectives stated in this description can only be achieved in the correct situation. So QEs must be suitably designed and operate effectively by your organization and function in combination with the vendor's controls. So QEs are always going to be documented within a SOC report, but oftentimes in different ways. It's usually depending on the preference of the vendor and the firm performing the SOC review. And we'll talk a little bit about where you can find QEs. So as we said, QEs are controls that you, as the user entity, must have in place as part of the service provider control environment. This slide here says you must review annually and document that you're in compliance, especially if you're subject to SOX 404 or the FDICAA. And one thing I do just want to point out here is that you may even need to review them more frequently than 1 year. You know, QEs are usually a part of a SOC cycle, so they should be reviewed at whatever cadence the SOC report is done. So if the SOC report that the QEs are in covers 3 months, then if that vendor provides a SOC report quarterly, you should expect to review those QEs 4 times that year. Because though there may not be major changes or significant changes, there could be changes in the QEs, especially as technology evolves. So you just want to make sure that you're not one and doneing it at the 1 year mark. When you're reviewing those QEs, what you want to do at a high level is you want to review the QEs and your associated control objectives to ensure context is understood. So not only do you want to make sure that you understand what your user entity control is, but also the control objectives that it is associated with. And then you want to determine which QEs apply to you, because not all of them will. Even though it's a comprehensive list, the way that you use or take the service or product provided, a specific QE may not apply to you. It's very important, though, that you assign each QE to a person or a team or role for responsibility. That way it ensures that it gets looked at. And then you have to determine which QEs are addressed already. So you might have them already addressed through program policies and processes, internal and external audits, and even in place in unwritten controls. So if that's the case, you do want to document that. And then you want to go back and address each applicable unaddressed QE, so whatever's left over. And the most important thing is to record how you're addressing each one. Document, document, document. And again, you want to assess the QEs with each new SOC report or with any significant internal changes. So you want to keep them on your radar for ongoing monitoring. Some common examples of QEs that you'll find are going to be things like logical access, so items with account provisioning, general IT controls and policies, account management, separation procedures, so termination procedures, timely account removals, regular assessment of accounts, authorization policies and procedures. These can ensure that transactions are appropriately authorized and that transactions are secure, timely, and complete. And then data transmission policies and procedures. This is an appropriate method like encryption that can be used to protect data during transmission. So when you're looking for the QEs in the SOC report, you're going to find them typically in Section 3 or Section 4, which is the description or tested control section of your vendor SOC report. QEs that are found in the description section or Section 3 usually include details on controls and how they relate to the control objectives found in the report. This subsection is often found toward the end of the description section, and QEs may also be found right in the tested controls section as well. And so you could see them in Section 4 where the tested controls are as a line item beneath each section. And showing how exactly they're mapped to the controls themselves. And in Section 3, they're usually in either a table format or list format, but you can always find them called out pretty directly in either one of those sections. And this just continues on to where to find the QEs. Like I said, Section 3 and Section 4 are going to be your most common areas. When they're in Section 3, there tends to be some additional detail on how exactly they relate to the control objectives. And in Section 4, you can kind of see them as they map directly to the control numbers. And of course, finding the QEs in the report is really only half the battle. You have to be able to understand what they mean to your organization. And that's going to be critical because they outline to you as the user of the product or service what roles and responsibilities and obligations that you have in ensuring that the stated control objectives are effective for your organization. So without implementing those QEs, you can't be certain that the controls will work as designed by the vendor.
We are to our last poll question of the day, and that question is, does your organization currently track QUEs and assign them internally? Yes, no, or not sure? Lisa, we have another question here from the audience that you can answer. How often should we actively renew and document our compliance with QUEs?
Great question, Jessie. So QUEs, or some people call them QEs, are usually part of every SOC cycle. So they really should be reviewed at whatever cadence the SOC report is done. This can feel cumbersome. So if the SOC report that has the QUEs are from covers 3 months, you should expect to review them 4 times that year, assuming that the vendor is doing their SOC reviews quarterly. If the SOC report covers a full year, I wouldn't expect to see new QUEs again for a year. I say this because with every SOC cycle, the vendor could change them. They may not. They may stay the same forever and just be, copy and pasted into each new SOC. But you really will need to be reviewing them at that same frequency as the SOC report. This also means that you should be reviewing the SOC report at whatever cadence they're being done by the vendor. So the idea of doing one review annually only really works if that SOC cycle is an annual cycle. If a vendor produces a SOC multiple times a year, then you're going to want to look at those QUs or QEs multiple times a year because you want to make sure that there's no change in what their expectations are of you as the user of that product or service.
On your screen now, you can see those results for the final poll. Thank you to everyone for answering this question. Before we move on, please be aware that our Understanding Subservice Organizations within Vendor SOC Reports infographic is available for download in the related content widget. Back to you, Lisa.
So now to go a little bit more in depth on how to review your vendor's QEs. Like we talked about briefly a couple slides back, reviewing the QEs and the associated control objectives to understand context is really important. You want to understand what the QE is applied to. And this needs to be done by a qualified individual who understands the use of the product and service, as well as the context of the control and the technical and business impact of implementation. Because you want to make sure that you can implement the QE, that it doesn't have a trickle-down effect to your team or your business unit somewhere down the line. And number two is determine which QEs apply to you, because not all of them are going to apply. Some QEs are not applicable based on how you use that product or service. And so you don't want to waste your time or your effort or your dollars trying to implement something that doesn't actually have anything to do with your use of a product. And this is especially important as vendors start to group products together in SOC reports, is understanding which QEs go with what. And then you want to make sure you're assigning QEs to a person, team, or role for responsibility. It's so important to assign the QE to a specific role in your organization so that they don't get lost with turnover, employee changes, etc. It allows for having role accountability and it ensures that you're always covered. As long as a QE is assigned to a role, then you have confidence that it gets performed when it needs to be performed, it gets audited when it needs to be audited, and it gets reviewed. And it also makes sure that the right people are doing the right things to implement it. And then you want to determine which QEs you're already addressing. And so this is really common. A lot of times QEs are pretty simple. And in many scenarios, you may already be doing the things that are listed as a complementary user entity control. And those are easy wins, so take them when you can. Things like logical access, principle of least privilege, segregation of duties, those are all really common QEs that you're probably already doing. So you just want to make sure that you can map your current practices to the QE adequately. So steps 1 through 4 are going to whittle down those QEs to just those that really matter to you in your organization, and those are the ones you want to address. And you want to record how each QE is addressed. Here are some questions to ask yourself. Is the QE similar to any of your organization's existing controls? Who owns the control and who takes responsibility for it? And how often is this control validated or tested for effectiveness? Those are the 3 things you want to ask yourself and that you want to document. And then you need to assess QEs with each new SOC report or with any significant internal changes. Unfortunately, QEs are not always stagnant, so they should always be reviewed with the SOC cycle. You want to review them at whatever cadence you're reviewing a SOC report. And then 8 is a little bit redundant, but so important. Document. And make sure that you are recording this work. We have been getting a lot of feedback from clients and vendors alike that regulators are looking for documented evidence of complementary user entity control validation, and that people are really able to demonstrate that they are performing those QE reviews and what they have in place to check that box as having those controls in place. Okay, so tips for mapping QEs. It's your organization's responsibility to ensure that you're meeting any regulatory or contractual requirements for your controls. So you want to map QEs to these requirements and then analyze what other requirements have not yet been fulfilled. Mapping QEs to appropriate business units is going to help ensure that controls are implemented by the proper SMEs, which is very important. And then consider which department would be most knowledgeable about each control and who would be best able to accomplish that control objective. Assigning the implementation of QEs to the SME is going to help provide the best assurance that the control objective is effective to ensure security. So the right people doing the right job. When mapping controls to your organization, make sure that the activities you are implementing are also included in your governance documentation to aid with consistency and accountability. This is just going to help you check those regulatory boxes. And remember that QEs are designed to give your organization confidence that security is not compromised by your vendor relationships. So you want to take them seriously. They are there to benefit you as well. And just to wrap up, we'll do a couple of key takeaways. And ultimately, whether you call them QEs or QUCs or CUECs or complementary user entity controls, what really matters is that you're understanding the SOC that you're reviewing and the product and service it covers and how you use that product or service, because that's really going to help you identify the QEs and how to determine which ones you are responsible for. You want to make sure that the person reviewing the QEs has context and understands your organization's relationship with the vendor and that product or service. And then you want to add QE review to your ongoing monitoring process. QEs change, so you want to make sure that you're not letting them be a one and done, and you want to make sure that they're following that SOC cadence. And then last but not least, like we say 100 times, document, document, document. You want to make sure that you are recording your compliance with those QEs and how you're implementing them across your organization.
Great. Thanks so much, Lisa. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending our second day of boot camp. I would also like to thank our experts from today, Kelly and Lisa, for their time in sharing some important information on vendor contracts, supply chain risk, data breaches, and vendor SOC reports. Tomorrow, on the third and final day of the boot camp, we will be joined around the campfire by VinMinder's Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy, Hillary Dewhurst, who will discuss the interagency guidance on third-party relationships, risk management, and the impact on your third-party risk management program. Then we will be joined by VinMinder's Raman Zachariah, Chief Financial Officer, who will discuss financial health in today's business climate. After a quick break, Jill Sherman, VinMinder's third-party principal, will cover the importance of vendor performance management. And Jill will be followed by Hillary once again to wrap up with program metrics and reporting and third-party risk management. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Kelly, this next question is for you. What does a periodic review of the vendor to include a contract review include?
Typically, in a periodic contract review, the most important thing you want to review is to make sure you are reminding yourself of the critical dates of the contract. Hopefully, you're tracking those anyway, but you always want to be refreshed and reminded of what your termination date for that particular relationship is, especially if you don't think you're going to continue it. And along with that termination date, you know what the notification dates are and the process, any specific requirements around that termination. So that's the number one thing you're looking at on a periodic review. But on a periodic review, you're also likely wanting to review the vendor's performance against the contract requirements that are around SLAs. And hopefully you're reviewing that SLA performance on a more frequent basis and probably annually. Hopefully you're looking at that monthly or quarterly. But you may not be doing a full contract review that frequently. You probably shouldn't need to, maybe on an annual basis or every 2 years. But also you're going to be looking at recent regulatory changes like those privacy laws that Lisa May just mentioned that continue to surface There may be changes in your regulatory environment or some risks associated with that vendor that you just need to ensure the language in your contract is protecting you against. So those are the things that a periodic contract review should include.
Great. Lisa, we'll hop over to you for this next question. And that is, should we build supply chain management into our third-party risk management program?
So absolutely. I mean, supply chain management is really about identifying risk as it relates to that flow of goods and services. So from a technology standpoint, this could be anything from embedding malware during production of technology, hardware, to a disruption caused by another inability to move a physical product to your location. So it sounds like a lot of times that supply chain management doesn't have anything to do with us or to do with TPRM, that they're separate, but really they're a partnership. And so ultimately that first step in understanding what your supply chain includes is that third-party risk management part. So that insight is going to help you determine the risks and then figure out where you need to focus your attentions and mitigations. So they cross paths, they hold hands. It's really a part of it from the get-go.
Great. And this next question is for you as well, Lisa. What is the difference between supply chain management and just regular business continuity due diligence?
That's a really good question. And ultimately, it's a focus, right? So, and we can talk about this a lot more. There's a lot of different pieces of it, so I don't want to go too long. But so supply chain management is really about, again, focusing on that flow of goods and understanding where things are coming from and how the pieces of the puzzle align. Regular business continuity and due diligence and business continuity management is more about focusing on the disruption itself and how your vendor is going to right size and how quickly. So when we talk about business continuity and that specific due diligence, you're specifically looking at that vendor and how they are going to recover recovery time objectives, recovery point objectives, how quickly can they restore availability. Whereas supply chain management is more about the various different pieces, and business continuity you're going to kind of look at within supply chain management.
Great. Kelly, we'll come back to you for this next question. And that question is, what is a transition clause and when is it used?
A transition clause is speaking to what happens when you terminate that contract with that vendor or supplier. So it should be speaking to the expectations that both sides have to what part each party will play. So what support the vendor is going to provide, what expectations you have as far as what will happen with your data when you terminate, what happens to your access to the product or service that that vendor is providing for you to you. So essentially it is mapping out the process when you exit the relationship. So hopefully it will, clearly outline those expectations so that when that time comes, whether it's an amicable termination or not, that there's no misunderstanding what kind of support you are going to get in that transition as you onboard to a new vendor, assuming you're going to a new vendor. And if there are known costs associated with that, hopefully that can be covered in that transition clause as well. So it's just making sure that there is a solid understanding up front in your relationship with your vendor, what will happen at the end of the relationship.
Thanks, Kelly. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thank you, Kelly and Lisa, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address offline. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. A big thank you to Kelly and Lisa for their time and content. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources related to third-party risk management topics, such as contracting, cybersecurity, SOC reports, and more. If you'd like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive Friday afternoon. Also in the email will be the survey link for you to request the CPE credits. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found Day 2 valuable. I'd like to thank Kelly and Lisa for their time again. On behalf of Inminder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you, and we'll see you tomorrow for the third and final day of the boot camp.